During the Second World War 593 Summary 593. Chapter 30. Development of Education 594 under Company Rule 594 A humble beginning by Charter Act of 1813 595 Orientalist Anglicist Controversy 595 Lord Macaulay's Minute 1835 595 Efforts of Thomson 596 Wood's Dispatch 1854 596 After the Crown Takeover 597 Hunter Education Commission 1882-83 597 Indian Universities Act 1904 598 Government Resolution on 599 Education Policy 1913 Sadler University Commission 1917-19 600 Education under Diarchy 602 Hartog Committee 1929 602 Sergeant Plan of Education 604 Development of Vernacular Education 607 to a brief history of modern India. The records of the East India Company provide a detailed account of trading conditions during the period 1600 to 1857. When the British Crown took over the administration, it also kept a large variety and volume of official records. These records help historians to trace every important development stage by stage and follow the processes of decision-making and the psychology of the policymakers. The records of the other European East India Companies, the Portuguese, Dutch, and French, are also useful for constructing the history of the 17th and 18th centuries. They are primarily important from the point of view of economic history, but much can be gathered from them about the political setup as well. There are also many contemporary and semi-contemporary works such as memoirs, biographies, and travel accounts which give us interesting as well as useful glimpses into the history of the 18th and early 19th centuries. Newspapers and journals made their appearance in the later part of the 18th century, and they provide very valuable information on almost all aspects of the Indian society, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. Other sources of modern Indian history include oral evidence, creative literature, and paintings. Archival materials. There are 4 categories of official records. I. Central Government Archives. 2. State Government Archives. 3. Records of intermediate and subordinate authorities. And 4. Judicial records. Apart from these, there are private archives and archival sources available abroad. Central Government Archives. The National Archives of India, located in New Delhi, contains most of the archives of the Government of India. These provide authentic and reliable source materials on varied aspects of modern Indian history. The records with the National Archives come under various groups, representing sources for the history of modern India. 3. Different branches of the Secretariat at different stages of its development. This happened as the work of the East India Company was distributed among various branches, public or general, revenue, political, military, secret, commercial, judicial, education, etc., and a separate set of records was kept for each of these branches or departments. With the appointment of James Rennell as the first Surveyor General of Bengal in 1767, the Survey of India began to scientifically map the unknown regions of the country and its bordering lands. The records of the Survey of India as well as the journals and memoirs of the surveyors provide valuable information not only on geographical matters but also on contemporary socio-economic conditions and other important historical aspects. The proceedings of the public, judicial, and legislative departments provide ample data for studying the social and religious policies of the colonial government. The government's policies on education and the growth of the education system during the colonial rule are mentioned in the educational records of the Central Archives. The papers bearing on the emergence of the nationalist movement were part of the public series of the Home Department records. But in 1907, a new series of records, Home Political, was started to deal exclusively with political and communal issues. The records of the Reforms Office are very useful for an analytical study of the constitutional developments from 1920 to 1937. Archives of the state governments. The source material in the state archives comprise the records of I. The former British Indian provinces, 2. The erstwhile princely states which were incorporated in the Indian Union after 1947, and 3. The foreign administrations other than those of the British. Apart from these, the records of those Indian powers which were taken over by the British, for instance, the archives of the Kingdom of Lahore, popularly known as Khalsa Darbar records from 1800 to 1849, are important source material. Another important collection of 4. A brief history of modern India. The pre-British Public Archives in India is the Peshwa Daftar housed in the Alienation Office, Pune. It forms the most valuable single source for the study of Maratha history for a period of almost a century before the fall of the Peshwas. For studying the history of the princely states of Rajasthan, viz. Jaipur, Bikaner, Jodhpur, Udaipur, etc., the archives of these states, now housed in the Rajasthan State Archives at Bikaner, are valuable. Similarly, the history of Dogra rule from 1846 in Jammu and Kashmir can be studied in the valuable collection of state papers housed at Jammu. The other significant archives of the princely states are those of Gwalior, Indore, Bhopal, and Rewa, all in Madhya Pradesh, Travancore and Cochin in Kerala, Mysore in Karnataka, and Kolhapur in Maharashtra. Archives of 3 presidencies. The early records of Fort Williams, Bengal Presidency, were lost during the sack of Calcutta in 1756, but the archives of the Bengal Presidency after the British victory at Plassey have survived more or less in a complete series, which are partly available in the National Archives of India and partly in the State Archives of West Bengal. The records of the Madras Presidency begin from AD 1670 and include records of the Governor and Council of Fort St. George. In these records, there is plenty of information bearing on the rise of the English East India Company as a political power in the south and in the Deccan, including the Anglo-French struggle and the English conflicts with other Indian powers. The archives of Bombay Presidency, housed in the Maharashtra Secretariat Record Office, Mumbai, are extremely useful in studying the history of Western India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Sindh, and the Kannada-speaking districts of the erstwhile Bombay Presidency which were incorporated in Mysore in 1956. Sack of Calcutta in 1756, but the archives of the Bengal Presidency after the British victory at Plassey have survived more or less in a complete series, which are partly available in the National Archives of India and partly in the State Archives of West Bengal. The records of the Madras Presidency begin from AD 1670 and include records of the Governor and Council of Fort Street, George. In these records, there is plenty of information bearing on the rise of the English East India Company as a political power in the south and in the Deccan, including the Anglo-French struggle and the English conflicts with other Indian powers. The archives of Bombay Presidency, housed in the Maharashtra Secretariat Record Office, Mumbai, are extremely useful in studying the history of Western India, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Sindh, and the Kannada-speaking districts of the erstwhile Bombay Presidency which were incorporated in Mysore in 1956. Archives of other European powers. The archives related to the Portuguese preserved in Goa, mainly belonging to the period from 1700 to 1900, are sources for the history of modern India. 5. Valuable for the history of Portuguese possessions in India. The orders and dispatches from Lisbon received in Goa and the responses and reports dispatched from India to Portugal constitute the most significant historical material among the Portuguese archives. The Dutch records of Cochin and Malabar are in the Madras Record Office and those of Chinsura in the State Archives of West Bengal. The French archives of Chandernagore and Pondicherry, now Puducherry, were taken to Paris by the French authorities before they relinquished these settlements. The archives of the Danish possessions were also transferred to Copenhagen when the Danes sold Tranquebar and Serampur to the English East India Company in 1845. The remaining Danish records, mainly relating to Tranquebar, 1777 to 1845, are now housed in the Madras Record Office. Judicial records housed in the Madras Record Office, the archives of the Mayor's Court at Fort Street, George, beginning from AD 1689, are the earliest available judicial archives. The pre-plus-se records of the Mayor's Court at Fort Williams have been lost, but those for the years 1757 to 73 are kept in the record room of the Calcutta High Court, along with the archives of the Supreme Court of Bengal, 1774 to 1861. Similarly, the records of the Mayor's Court at Bombay established in 1728 are available in the Maharashtra Secretariat Record Office, which also has the custody of the archives of the Bombay Recorder's Court and the Supreme Court. Apart from containing the proceedings and minutes, this category of records contains copies of wills, probates, and letters of administration which are useful for genealogical studies and for investigations pertaining to the state of society and economic conditions in the respective regions. Published archives. The most significant archival publications are the parliamentary papers which include many excerpts from the records of the East India Company and the Government of India under the 6. A brief history of modern India. Crown. The reports of the Parliamentary Select Committees, various royal commissions constituted on specific subjects like education, civil reforms and famines, and the parliamentary debates on the Indian Empire are indispensable. The proceedings of the Indian and provincial legislatures, the weekly gazettes published by the central and the provincial governments, and collections of laws and regulations issued from time to time also serve as useful source material for historical research. Private archives. Private archives comprise papers and documents of individuals and families of note who played a significant role in the development of modern India. The papers of eminent leaders of the nationalist movement and the records of organizations like the Indian National Congress are housed in the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library in New Delhi. The archives of banks, business houses, and chambers of commerce are extremely helpful in the study of economic changes. Foreign repositories, a vast body of historical material related to the history of modern India, is available in the repositories of erstwhile imperialist powers, who ruled in different parts of the Indian subcontinent as well as in some other countries. In England, the India Office records, London, and the records kept in the British Museum are very valuable. The India Office records possesses various important documents, the minutes of the courts of directors and the General Court of the East India Company and various committees constituted from time to time, the minutes and correspondence of the Board of Control or the Board of Commissioners for the Affairs of India, and the records of the Secretary of State and the India Council. The British Museum possesses collections of papers of British viceroys, secretaries of states, and other high-rank civil and military officials who were posted in India. The archives of the missionary societies, for instance, of the Church Missionary Society of London, provide insight. Sources for the history of modern India 7. Into the educational and social development in pre-independent India. The Archives Nationales, Paris, and the archives of the French Ministries of Foreign Affairs, Colonies and War have records that throw light on the history of French possessions as well as the socio-political conditions. The records of the Dutch East India Company is available in Rijksarchief, The Hague, and that of the Danish and Portuguese are kept in Copenhagen and Lisbon, respectively. Apart from the archives of the European nations, the archives preserved in Pakistan are of utmost importance. The West Pakistan Record Office, Lahore, Record Office, Peshawar, records available in Sindh, etc., give information about the regional history of the Indian subcontinent besides shedding light on India's relations with Afghanistan, Iran, and other neighboring countries in the colonial era. Biographies, memoirs, and travel accounts. Many travelers, traders, missionaries, and civil servants who came to India have left accounts of their experiences and their impressions of various parts of India. An important group among these writers was that of the missionaries who wrote to encourage their respective societies to send more missionaries to India for the purpose of evangelizing its inhabitants. In this genre, Bishop Heber's Journal and Abbé Dubos' Hindu Manners and Customs provide useful information on the socio-economic life of India during the period of decline of the Indian powers and the rise of the British. Some of the famous British travelers who wrote travel accounts were George Forster, Benjamin Heine, James Burns, Narrative of a Visit to the Court of Sindh, Alexander Burns, Travels into Bokhara, C.J.C. Davidson, Diary of the Travels and Adventures in Upper India, and John Butler, Travels and Adventures in the Province of 8. A Brief History of Modern India. Assam. Famous non-British travelers who wrote about India include Victor Jacquemont, Letters from India, describing a journey in the British dominions of India, Tibet, Lahore, and Kashmir during the years 1828, 1829, 1830-1831, Baron Charles, Travels in Kashmir and the Punjab, and William Moorcroft. These travel accounts are indispensable and generally reliable sources for constructing the history of modern India, especially as they supplement the official papers. Newspapers and journals. Newspapers and journals of the 19th and 20th centuries, published in English as well as in the different vernacular languages, form an important and authentic source of information for the construction of the history of modern India. The first attempts to publish newspapers in India were made by the disgruntled employees of the English East India Company who sought to expose the malpractices of private trade. For instance, in 1776, William Bowles, being censured by the Court of Directors for private trading, resigned from the company and announced his intention to publish a newspaper. The official response to Bowles' scheme was strong, and his plan ended before materializing. In 1780, James Augustus Hickey published the first newspaper in India entitled the Bengal Gazette or Calcutta General Advertiser. Hickey's press was seized within 2 years, owing to his outspoken criticism of government officials. Afterwards, many publications appeared such as the Calcutta Gazette. 1784, the Madras Courier, 1788, and the Bombay Herald, 1789. The newspapers and journals of the early period primarily aimed at catering to the intellectual entertainment of the Europeans and Anglo-Indians. From the second half of the 19th century, many powerful newspapers appeared, edited, published by distinguished and fearless journalists. Interestingly, nearly sources for the history of modern India 9. One-third of the founding fathers of the Indian National Congress in 1885 were journalists. Some of their publications were The Hindu and Swadeshmitran under the editorship of G. Subramania Iyer, Kesari and Maharatta under Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bengali under Surendranath Banerjee, Amrita Bazar Patrika under Sisir Kumar Ghosh and Motilal Ghosh, Sudharak under Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, Indian Mirror under N.N. Sen, Voice of India under Dadabhai Nauroji, and Hindustan and Advocate under G.P. Verma. The Tribune and Akhbar-i in Punjab, Indu Prakash, Gyan Prakash, Kal, and Gujarati in Bombay, and Som Prakash Banganivasi and Sadharani in Bengal were other noted newspapers of the time. Indian nationalists and revolutionaries living abroad published newspapers and journals. Indian sociologist, London, Shyamji Krishnavarma, Bande Matram, Paris, Madam Kama, Talwar, Berlin, Virendranath Chattopadhyay, and Gdar, San Francisco, Lala Hardayal. To infuse a feeling of nationalism among Indians living abroad. Newspapers depict almost all aspects of life in colonial India from around the 1870s onwards. From the 1920s onwards, newspapers tracked the major events during the freedom struggle. However, newspaper accounts cannot be seen as unprejudiced or completely objective. The accounts that were published in a newspaper in London by the pro-British Raj people were bound to be different from the report in an Indian nationalist paper. Oral evidence. Oral history refers to the construction of history with the help of non-written sources, for instance, personal reminiscence. Oral sources allow historians to broaden the boundaries of their discipline and corroborate their findings from other sources of history. However, many historians remain skeptical of the veracity of oral history. 10. A brief history of modern India. Creative literature. The most significant outcome of the Indo-European contact was the literary genre of the novel which emerged in the latter half of the 19th century. The first important writer of that period was the Bengali novelist Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, 1838-94. His novels are mostly historical, the best known among them being Anandamath, 1882, noted for its powerful lyric Vande Mataram and depiction of the Sannyasi revolt, 1760s. His last novel Rajasinha can be called the grand final to his remarkable career. Icharam Suryaram Desai, 1853-1912, was a fine scholar of medieval Gujarati literary history. His first novel Hind Aane Britannia was one of the earliest Indian novels with political overtones. Tamil writers like Girija Devi and Ramtirthammal, who wrote Mona Rajni, 1931, and Dasikaleen Mosavlai, 1936, respectively, also made the novel an effective vehicle of social experience. G. V. Krishna Rao's Kilubommalu, The Puppets, 1956 in Telugu was concerned with the moral aspects and behavior of the rural people. Vaikam Muhammad Bashir, 1910-1994, was one of the eminent writers in Malayalam whose famous novel Balyaklaski, The Childhood Friends, 1944, was a tragic tale of love. Similarly, Thakazhi Shivshankara Pillai became prominent for his two extremely well-written works in Malayalam, Tottiyude Makkan, Son of a Scavenger, 1948, and Chemmeen, Shrimps, 1956. Despite having different educational backgrounds and social outlooks, all these writers shared a strong sense of realism and deep interest in the life of the marginalized and oppressed sections of the society. These novels give a picture of the social milieu of the days they relate to. Painting. Some information on the socio-economic, political, and cultural life during the colonial period can be obtained from the paintings of that period. The company paintings also. Sources for the history of modern India 11. Referred as Patna Kalam emerged under the patronage of the East India Company. They picturize the people and scenes as they existed at the time. Trades, festivals, dances, and the attire of people are visible in these works. Company paintings continued to be popular in the 19th century until the introduction of photography in India in the 1840s. The pictorial images produced by the British and Indians, paintings, pencil drawings, etchings, posters, cartoons, and bazaar prints are especially important records of the Great Revolt of 1857. The British pictures offer images that were meant to provoke a range of different emotions and reactions. Some of them commemorate the British heroes who saved the English and repressed the rebels. Relief of Lucknow, painted by Thomas Jones Barker in 1859, is one such example. Another painting of this period, In Memoriam by Joseph Noel Pato, recorded in Painting 2 Years of the Revolt of 1857. One can see English women and children huddled in a circle, looking helpless and innocent, seemingly waiting for the inevitable dishonor, violence, and death. These paintings of the Mutini period are important for the historian to interpret and understand the worldviews of the British and the Indians regarding this major event. Kalighat painting that came to the fore in Calcutta in the 19th century depicted not only mythological figures but also ordinary people engaged in their everyday lives. The latter pictures captured the social changes taking place in the Calcutta of the time. These paintings made a comment on the social evils of the time. Some of these paintings satirized certain modes adopted by the people of the time. In the last decades of the 19th century, a new art movement emerged, which received its primary stimulus from the growing nationalism in India. Artists like Nandalal Bose and Raja Ravi Verma were representatives of this new trend. In the rise of the Bengal school led by Abnindranath Tagore, nephew of Rabindranath Tagore, E.B. Havell, who joined the art school in Calcutta as principal, and Ananda Kentish Kumaraswamy, son of an important Tamil political. 12. 12. A brief history of modern India. Summary. Sources of modern Indian history archival materials consist of public, private, and foreign repositories. Public archives include the archives of the governments of India, archives of state governments, archives of the three presidencies of Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, and judicial records. Private archives papers and documents of individuals and families of note who played a significant role in the development of modern India. Foreign repositories, Indian office records in London, Record Office, Lahore, etc. Biographies and memoirs, accounts of travelers, traders, missionaries and civil servants during the 18th and 19th centuries, as well as memoirs written by Indian leaders during the independence movement. Newspapers and journals published in India as well as abroad. Others, oral tradition, creative literature, painting. Leader in Sri Lanka played a vital role. Though many of the paintings of this new trend primarily focused on themes of Indian mythology and cultural heritage, they are important sources for studying the modern art movement in India and for the art historians. Chapter 2. Major approaches to the history of modern India. Looking at how histories are written is part of the study of the intellectual history of the period under discussion and can provide a variety of ideas and explanations. The starting point in the history of a society, therefore, has to be a familiarity with its historiography, the study of historical interpretation. This provides recognition of the intellectual context of history, instead of seeing history as just a narration of events. The modern history of India, for the convenience of understanding, can be read broadly under four historiographic approaches: the colonial, or the imperialist, nationalist, Marxist, and subaltern, each with its own distinct characteristics and modes of interpretation. However, there are other approaches: communalist, Cambridge, liberal and neoliberal, and feminist interpretations, which have also influenced historical writing on modern India. 13. View. The production of histories of India has become very frequent in recent years and may well call for some explanations. The reason is a twofold one: changes in the Indian scene requiring a reinterpretation of the facts and changes in the attitudes of historians about the essential elements of Indian history. Percival Spear. 14. A brief history of modern India. Colonial approach. For the major part of the 19th century, the colonial school occupied a high position in India. The term colonial approach has been used in two senses. One relates to the history of the colonial countries, while the other refers to the works which were influenced by the colonial ideology of domination. It is in the second sense that most historians today write about the colonial historiography. In fact, the practice of writing about the colonial countries by the colonial officials was related to the desire for domination and justification of the colonial rule. Hence, in most such historical works, there was criticism of indigenous society and culture. Simultaneously, there was praise for the Western culture and values and glorification of the individuals who established the colonial empires. The histories of India written by James Mill, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, Vincent Smith, and many others are pertinent examples of the colonial historiographical trend. Certain characteristics common to most of the works of these historians are the following: I. Orientalist representation of India. 2. The opinion that the British brought unity to India. 3. The notions of social Darwinism. The English considered themselves superior to the natives and the fittest to rule. 4. India viewed as a stagnant society which required guidance from the British. White man's burden. And we, establishing Pax Britannica to bring law and order and peace to a bickering society. Nationalist approach. The nationalist approach to Indian history can be described as one which tends to contribute to the growth of nationalist feelings and to unify people in the face of religious, caste, or linguistic differences or class differentiation. This approach. Major approaches to the history of modern India 15 looks at the national movement as a movement of the Indian people, which grew out of the growing awareness among all people of the exploitative nature of colonial rule. This approach developed as a response to and in confrontation with the colonial approach. It should be noted that the nationalist historians of modern India did not exist before 1947. Before 1947, nationalist historiography mainly dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history. However, in the last quarter of the 19th century, a detailed and scientific critique of colonialism for the adverse economic aspects of alien rule was developed by nationalists like Dadabhai Nauroji, M.G. Ranade, G.V. Joshi, R.C. Dutt, K.T. Telang, G.K. Gokhale, and D. Vacha. Sakharam Ganesh Deuskar, a close associate of Sri Aurobindo, popularized the ideas of Nauroji and Ranade in his Desha Katha published in 1904 in Bengali. The only accounts of the national movement was by nationalist leaders, not historians, such as R.G. Pradhan, A.C. Majumdar, J.L. Nehru, and Pattabhi Sitarmaya. R.C. Majumdar and Tara Chand are noted nationalist historians of modern India. Marxist approach. The beginning of the Marxist approach in India was heralded by two classic books, Rajni Palme Dutt's India Today and A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism. Originally written for the famous Left Book Club in England, India Today, first published in 1940 in England, was later published in India in 1947. A.R. Desai's Social Background of Indian Nationalism was first published in 1948. Unlike the imperialist colonial approach, the Marxist historians clearly see the primary contradiction between the interests of the colonial masters and the subject people, as well as the process of the nation in the making. Unlike the nationalists, they also take full note of the inner contradictions between the different sections of the people of the Indian society. However, some of them, particularly Rajni Palme. 16. A Brief History of Modern India. Dutt were unable to fully integrate their treatment of the primary anti-imperialist contradiction and the secondary inner contradictions and tended to counterbalance the anti-imperialist struggle with the class or social struggle. They tend to see the national movement as a structured bourgeois movement, if not the bourgeoisie's movement, and miss its open-ended and all-class character. Another noted Marxist historian, who made a critique of R.P. Dutt's paradigm, is Sumit Sarkar. He considers Dutt's paradigm as a simplistic version of the Marxian class approach. He looks at the nationalist leaders in the light of intelligentsia, which acts as a kind of proxy for as yet passive social forces with which it had little organic connection. A.R. Desai traces the growth of the national movement in 5 phases, each phase based on particular social classes which supported and sustained it. Subaltern approach. This school of thought began in the early 1980s under the editorship of Ranjit Guha as a critique of the existing historiography, which was faulted for ignoring the voice of the people. Right from the beginning, subaltern historiography took the position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography had an elitist bias. For the subaltern historians, the basic contradiction in Indian society in the colonial epoch was between the elite, both Indian and foreign, on the one hand, and the subaltern groups, on the other, and not between colonialism and the Indian people. However, they do not subscribe to the Marxist theory of the nature of the exploitation by the nationalist movement. They point out that the Indian society of the time could not be seen in terms of class alone, as capitalism in the country was just nascent at the time. This school sees nationalism as exploitative in terms of caste, gender, religious, and creed divisions. Nationalism, say the subalterns, ignored the internal contradictions within the society as well as what the major approaches to the history of modern India 17 marginalized represented or had to say. They believe that the Indian people were never united in a common anti-imperialist struggle, that there was no such entity as the Indian national movement. Instead, they assert, there were two distinct movements or streams, the real anti-imperialist stream of the subalterns and the bogus national movement of the elite. The elite streams, led by the official leadership of the Indian National Congress, were little more than a cloak for the struggle for power among the elite. Communalist approach. The historians of this school, relying completely on the colonial historiography of medieval India and colonial era textbooks, viewed Hindus and Muslims as permanent hostile groups whose interests were mutually different and antagonistic to each other. This view was not only reflected in the writings of the historians, but also took a more virulent form in the hands of the communal political leaders. In their view, India's medieval history was one long story of Hindu-Muslim conflict. As a corollary of this view, it was then argued that the 19th and 20th century Muslims had the happy and proud ever-present memory of having been the ruling class, while Hindus had the sad and humiliating memory of having been the subject race. This, ultimately, developed mutual hatred among these groups, often resulting in communal riots and, in the end, led to the partition of India. A few historians have of late initiated a new trend, described by its proponents as subaltern, which dismisses all previous historical writing, including that based on a Marxist perspective, as elite historiography, and claims to replace this old, blinkered historiography with what it claims is a new people's or subaltern approach. Bipin Chandra 18. A Brief History of Modern India. Cambridge School Approach. According to this school of thought, the fundamental contradiction under colonial rule was not between imperialism and the Indian people, but among the Indians themselves. Further, Indian nationalism was not the product of a struggle of the Indian people against colonial exploitation, but what arose from conflict among the Indians for getting the benefits given to them by the British rulers. The leaders of the national movement, according to this school, were inspired by the quest for power and material benefits. This approach has been criticized by many scholars on the ground that it takes the mind or ideals out of human behavior and reduces nationalism to animal politics. Liberal and neoliberal approach. According to this interpretation, the economic exploitation of the colonies was not beneficial to the British people as a whole. The availability of markets for British industrial goods in the colonial world and capital investment in overseas markets, like laying of railways in India, might have actually discouraged domestic investment and delayed the development of the new industries in Britain. The proponents of this school of thought are Patrick O'Brien, Hopkins, and Kane. Feminist approach. The shift in terms of the writing of women's history began with the women's movement of the 1970s, which provided the context and impetus for the emergence of women's studies in India. Very soon, women's history broadened and assumed the more complex shape of gender history. In the early years, the endeavor was to write a history of women to supplement the writings of mainstream history. Also, an attempt was made to research and compile an archive of major approaches to the history of modern India. 19. Women's writing. An important area of research has been analysis of the way in which colonial structures, such as the legal structure, affected women's lives. Women's vulnerability due to the denial of ownership of productive resources has been focused on in the analysis of how progressive laws shaped gender relations. In the colonial period, two works based upon the woman's question in India, The High Caste Hindu Woman, 1887, by Pandita Ramabai, and Mother India, 1927, by Catherine Mayo, attracted international attention. Summary. Different approaches. Colonial approach is influenced by the colonial ideology of domination. It focuses on criticism of indigenous society and culture and praises the Western culture and values. James Mill, Vincent Smith, etc. followed this approach. Nationalist approach evolved as a response to and in confrontation with the colonial approach. Before independence, this school dealt with the ancient and medieval periods of Indian history and not the modern period. After independence, this school focused on modern India. R.C. Majumdar and Tara Chand belonged to this school. Marxist approach focuses on the primary contradiction between the interests of the colonial masters and the native subjects. It also takes notice of the inner contradictions between the different sections of Indian society. R.P. Dutt and A.R. Desai were noted Marxist historians of India. Subaltern approach takes the position that the entire tradition of Indian historiography has an elitist bias and the role of the common masses has been neglected. Ranjit Guha belonged to this school. Communalist approach views Hindus and Muslims as permanently hostile groups whose interests are mutually different and antagonistic to each other. 20. A brief history of modern India. Cambridge School envisages Indian nationalism as a product of conflicts among the Indians themselves for getting the benefits from the British rulers. For them, Indian nationalist leaders were inspired by the greed of power and material benefits. Liberal and neoliberal interpretations imply that the economic exploitation of the colonies was not beneficial to the people of Britain as it delayed the development of the new industries in Britain. Feminist historiography focuses on areas of research that analyze colonial structures, such as the legal structure, which affected women's lives. It also focuses on women's vulnerability due to the denial of ownership of productive resources. Chapter 3. Advent of the Europeans in India.